want to begin tonight's class with language, with words. This is class 4 of Pasach Eliyahu, and I hope you've hung in there with us, and I trust and I hope that we've learned something meaningful and deep and linear, which means to say we've actually moved from point A to point B and not simply gone around and around in a circle. The concepts that we've explored, we can divide into 3 levels, basically. Higher than Atzilus, which is Midas, or Sfiris, which is, so to speak, the central controversy of this Maamar, and then Bria, which is not godliness. So I want to tell you the language that is classic to the Chassidic framework about these levels. I'll tell you the words first, and then I'll try to tell you what the words mean within a limited framework of time. The Ein Sof, that means godliness above Atzilus, that in this Maamar is called, before the Tzimtzum, is called the Mahus of Etzem of Ein Sof. Atzilus or Sfiris would be called Gilui or Ha'ara of the Mahus of Ein Sof. And Bria and Yetzira and Asiya and so forth would be called the Metzias of Ein Sof. So the 3 levels are the Etzem of the Mahus of the Ein Sof, or Gilui or Ha'ara of the Ein Sof, and the Metzias of the Ein Sof. The idea is this: in Atzilus and higher than Atzilus, you know godliness. Knowing godliness is being one with godliness. You don't know godliness by processing it. You know godliness by being sensitive to it, by being tuned into it, being intimate with it, like a merkava, as it's called in some contexts. And that's what mahus means. Mahus means one who was tuned in to the mahu, to the what is of God or godliness. The difference is that higher than Atzilus, you have Ein Sof, you have godliness, but you don't really have vessels, you don't really have kelim. In other words, higher than Atzilus, there is no zulas, there is nothing other than the Ein Sof itself to receive the Ein Sof. And as a consequence, the Ein Sof exists in its etzem state. The meaning of the word etzem, at least my definition of the word etzem, is anything that exists in relationship with itself. Godliness higher than Atzilus doesn't really have a recipient, doesn't really have a zulas, as Chassidus would call it, to be the conductor or the recipient or the translator of the Ein Sof into its own image. And as a result, the Ein Sof exists as Ein Sof is by itself, thus the word etzem, and it is therefore called the etzem of the Mahus of Ein Sof. Higher than Atzilus, the Ein Sof is experienced in its richness, in its infinity, but in its essential, in relationship with itself-like way, and it is therefore called the etzem of the Mahus of the Ein Sof. Atzilus has kelim, midas, 10. Consequently, the light of the Ein Sof has to meet and illuminate those vessels, and that's a meeting of 2 different things, arguably 2 very different things, almost contradictory things. The Ein Sof light, which is one and plain and infinite, and the diverse and distinctive and limited vessels. And consequently, the revelation of the Ein Sof becomes the key component here. It's not just the Mahus of Ein Sof, it's the Gilu or the Ha'ara of the Mahus of Ein Sof. Ein Sof as it's meeting another, a Zulas. And I want to share with you a phrase, a piskam, which is found in the Viadaita Moskva, one of the basic Hasidic discourses that's, I guess you could call it classic without the word being overly used. And the previous Rebbe quotes it in the famous Hemshech Tzadik Daled. And the quote goes as follows: Kol gilui ha'atzmi hu helam lagabe azulas. V'chol gilui lagabe azulas hu helam ha'atzmi. Which translates into when one reveals the essence. In other words, when one reveals what one is in relationship with himself, hu helam lagabe azulas, nobody else knows it. The truth of what I am, nobody will know. V'chol gilui lagabe azulas, if there's a revelation to another, and the other gets it, hu helam atzmi. It covers over what one is in relationship with themselves. And in context, this piska means Ein Sof higher than Atzilus is Gili ha'atzmi. It's godliness in relationship with itself. Nobody knows it except for godliness. Atzilus is the Ein Sof as it's revealed to another, namely vessels, and consequently, it's Helem ha'atzmi. How godliness is by itself is unknown, and what is known is godliness is able to relate to a vessel. So, if you think about it, the difference between Ein Sof higher than Atzilus and Sof in Atzilus is both are Ein Sof, both are Mahus. But one is Gili al Azulus, one is revelation to his other, the vessels, and the other is not. And therefore, though both are Ein Sof, in Echos, in quality, there's an incredible difference between the two. In terms of a mashal, in terms of explaining what I just described using an illustration or an analog, the mashal for the Ein Sof generally used in Chassidus is tainug, pleasure or delight. The reason tainug is a metaphor for the Ein Sof is because, according to Chassidus, pleasure or delight is not an emotion. Because emotions are called midas, which means measurements, limitations, distinct aspects. Pleasure is the experience of euphoria. Pleasure is the experience of going up into yourself. Pleasure is the conscious person being raised above the conscious level of reality to a place of harmony and peace, security and perfection. As I've explained it to you in an earlier class, our soul is very, very rich. We are not rich. Our soul lacks nothing. We lack everything. In other words, the body is designed to need everything. The body has a mind, which means it can know ideas, but it doesn't know any ideas. It's chassid. The body has a heart, which is able to experience emotions, feelings, but it doesn't have any actual feelings. It has the potential for feelings. It's chassid. And the same is true of the senses. The neshama is rich. The neshama is perfect. So delight, tainug, is when one is raised above the consciousness of themselves, which is in need of so many things that it doesn't have unless it acquires them, to a level within the person that simply has everything. That's why pleasure is so pleasuring, so pleasuresome, feels so good, because you're going from a place of need to a place of have. And I think that that's an interesting mystical version of why people get involved in compulsions, in abuse of pleasure, because pleasure feels very rich, it feels very secure, but when it's material pleasures, physical pleasures, animal pleasures that you're after, it's a lie. Because when you are experiencing a delight from a physical thing, you don't have anything. You just have a distraction from your needs, and that's why you do it again and again and again. But pleasure from spirituality, pleasure from an idea of Chassidus, for example, that delight is actually the godliness that's the source of that idea, and therefore it has some reality to it, it has some meaning to it, and so forth. So, in short, pleasure, delight, becomes the metaphor for godliness. Godliness is infinite, and pleasure is the infinity within the person. It's the place within our subconscious where we just have everything. But there's two levels of pleasure. There's pleasure from things, and there's pleasure from just existing. What we call in Chassidus, tainug hamurkav and tainug hapashat. Juxtaposed delight versus or plain delight. Delight from something, pleasure from something, versus pleasure from nothing in particular. So the way you would use the metaphor would go as follows. The Ein Sof that is higher than Atzilus is the muhus of the etzem of Elokus. Godliness in relationship with itself, which is not revealed to another, would be, in terms of the human experience, a person who's experiencing the delight of his soul from nothing other than the soul itself. While the delight of the Sfiras of Atzilus, or the Midas of Atzilus, which would be Muhus of Ha'ara, or Giloi of Ein Sof, how godliness is juxtaposed against Sfiras, would be how I'm experiencing a delight from something, a delight from learning an idea, a delight from doing a favor, a delight from experiencing something sensual, where I'm also experiencing my subconscious and my essence, but I'm experiencing it as it's juxtaposed against something else, which gives it character and definition and revelation and also diminution. So there is the muhus of the etzem of Ein Sof, which is taineg apashot. the Mahus of the Ha'ara of Ein Sof, we're just Tanya Murkav. This is Ein Sof, this is Atzilus, and then you get the Bria. Bria is not Ein Sof at all. So you have Metzias. And as I explained to you on an earlier occasion, Metzias pretty correctly, pretty accurately means proof of. The knowledge that there is the existence of the Ein Sof, but not the experience of it. In other words, in Bria, you know about Ein Sof, but you don't know what Ein Sof is. You know that Ein Sof is, but you don't have the experience of the Ein Sof. And in terms of a metaphor, that would be ideas. When one studies the concepts of the Ein Sof, they can study and study and study and study and study. They know about the Ein Sof, but all the intellectual pursuit in the world will not get you in touch with the Ein Sof itself. That's a spiritual experience. That's a transcendent experience. That's an esoteric experience. That's a gift of God. So in Bria and down, you know about Ein Sof. Metzias, you haven't met the Ein Sof. In Atzilus, you know the Ein Sof itself. Mahus, but only the Mahus of a Ha'ara, and in Ein Sof, which is higher than Atzilus, you know the Mahus of the Etzem, of the Ein Sof. So we've been discussing the complexity of the relationship between the Mahus of the Ha'ara of the Ein Sof and the Mahus of the Etzem of the Ein Sof. In other words, what kind of relationship is there between the Ein Sof of the Midas of Atzilus and the plain Ein Sof which is beyond it? And we illustrated it by using the Kochas HaNefesh, the human faculties, and their relationship to the soul itself as a metaphor, as an illustration. And we brought up last week the issue of Tzimtzum. And Tzimtzum has two diametrically opposed components. One is Siluk, the light is removed completely. And the removal of the light completely demonstrates how radically separate or distant the Midas or the Kav is from the Ein Sof. And as I explained it to you last week, it isn't simply that the Ein Sof is removed, creating a distance, but the re-emergence of the Ein Sof after the Tzimtzum is a fight, is a bekia, has to burst through the Tzimtzum itself, and as a result, the light that emerges through the Tzimtzum is B'shini HaMahus, or Oil Shal Tul, it's a brand new light, a light of a completely different caliber to the Pshitas of the Ein Sof, which came before, a Ha'ara of the Mahus of the Ein Sof as opposed to the Etzem of the Mahus of the Ein Sof. So the one side of the coin is that the Midas of Atzilus are terribly far away from the plain Ein Sof because they had to burst through Cheshech HaTzimtzum. The flip side of that coin is what we call in our culture Chazer V'Heyer. That the light of the Ein Sof that comes down into the Midas and Sfiras, notwithstanding that it's gone through the Tzimtzum and all that that entails, is B'derech Kiruv, it's close. So Midas of Atzilus are far and near, very distant from the Ein Sof because of the Siluk and the Bekiya, very close to the Ein Sof because it's Chazav V'Heir and B'derech Kiruv. This is the drama, this is the dynamism, this is the duality, this is the tension, if you will, in the relationship between the Midas of Atzilus and the Ein Sof. What about Atzilus and Bria? In other words, so far we talked about Atzilus in its relationship to what is beyond, the Midas, the Kav, in relationship to the Ein Sof and to the Pshitas of Ein Sof. What about Atzilus versus Bria? Now Atzilus is Midas, which gives it something in common with Bria. And Atzilus is Ein Sof, which gives it something in common with the Ein Sof. Thus, it's the hinge. Thus, it's the missing link. It's the central link between Ein Sof and creation because it has something in common with the lower realms, that it's Midah, something in common with the transcendent realms, that it is Ein Sof. And we have so far explored the drama and the tension of the connection between the Midas of Atzilus and the Ein Sof and the two sides that I articulated before. Now we're going to explore what about the relationship between Atzilus and Bria. And let us begin to read line 105, please. However, so far we've explored the closeness and distance between the Midas of Atzilus, the Mahus of the Ha'ara of Ein Sof, and the Ein Sof itself, which is called the Etzem of the Mahus of the Ein Sof. What about Inyan HaParsha Sheben Atzilus LeBria, the screen or curtain that separates the world of Atzilus from the world of Bria, Ubein Bria V'chulu, and the world of Bria and the world of Yetzirah? If between Ein Sof and Atzilus there's something called a Tzimtzum, and Tzimtzum has two sides. A, totally remove and burst through. B, Chazav, Heyer, and Kiruv. Between Bria and Atzilus, you have a similar duality. Because between Atzilus and Bria, there's a screen, there's a curtain. And I'm terrible at suspense, so I'm not even going to try to keep it. The two sides of the issue of Parsha are, number one, that the light of Atzilus itself descends into Bria. It isn't removed and brought back. It itself goes into the screen. But the other side of the coin is that the screen changes the light completely, and what comes out the opposite side is far away. The metaphor would be a screen. You have white light shining through a colored glass window or a colored Venetian blind window shade, whatever the case may be. On the one hand, it's the light itself that's going through the screen. On the other hand, the screen is absorbing most of the wavelengths and allowing through a light which is only one wavelength or several wavelengths, which is an entirely new mahus, entirely new form, entirely new identity. So here too, there are two opposite extremes. On the one hand, the light of Atzilus itself is being invested into Bria, not being removed and being brought back as something new. On the other hand, as it emerges, it is very distant because it has changed its character fundamentally. It's not a question of more mahus or less mahus, etzem of mahus or or of mahus. Now we're dealing with mitzias. Mitzias means no one knows godliness. We know about godliness. Pardon me. And the difference between knowing godliness and knowing about godliness is extraordinary, is literally indescribable. It's quantum separated. To talk about godliness and to know godly intimately is the difference between being an actual Kabbalist and a Kabbalistic pontificator, which is something that pretty much anybody with a mind can do. It's incredibly distinct. So now we're going to discuss Parsha, the screen between Atzilus and Bria, and its duality, its tension, its two-sidedness that results in the emergence of the metzias of a world or godliness as opposed to the mahus as it descends from Atzilus into Bria. And he gives you an example. And you know what the example, what the mashal for Parsha is? The mashal of a mashal. The metaphor to explain the transition from Atzilus to Bria is the metaphor of a metaphor. And here's how. Al derech mashal, for example. A scholar, an intellectual, a teacher, a master, who wishes to explain an extraordinarily profound idea to a student of his, in a case, the student cannot get it directly. So, what do you do when someone doesn't understand what you're saying? You explain it better, and you use more words. What happens when you use more words? It becomes easier to comprehend, right? But it also can get so complicated, so verbose, so wordy that the person becomes entangled and confused. And there are occasions, or there are circumstances, where it's simply inexplicable. You cannot say what you understand. Words don't exist. The intelligence isn't there on the behalf of the student to allow the idea to be communicated, no matter how many words and how many levels of compromise and dissent you're going to apply to the idea. So you use something very, very interesting. A mashal, a metaphor, an analog. What does that mean? I'm trying to explain a mystical concept to you, and I give you an example from something physical. What do the mashal and nimshal have in common? The analogy and what it is analogous to share almost nothing. They're very far apart. B'derech mashal v'chida, using a metaphor, and if a metaphor doesn't work, use a riddle, which is even more distant. Ukmai mishlei shleime, like the Proverbs. King Solomon speaks in Proverbs, speaks in allegory, because his wisdom is so abstract and so transcendent and so inclusive, there's no way for him to say what he wishes to say directly without using a metaphor. Like, for example, the metaphor of l'shmarchel me'isha zara, to protect you from an alien woman as opposed to an appropriate wife. Shehi mashal lahanimshal, it's a metaphor that's meant to represent shemadaber b'avodah zara. An alien woman means idol worship. Shehi zara medivrei Torah b'chol, which is foreign to the words of Torah. And of course, an appropriate wife would be the study of Torah. Now, who would ever think that an appropriate woman or an inappropriate woman to marry would represent different categories of ideas? But that's the whole point. Shlomo is afraid we won't relate to the ideas in their original, so he uses a metaphor which is very removed from the original ideas. The same is true across the board. That's why people use examples and metaphor. Kamei, for example, we bring an analogy. Mitvorim shutim gashmiyim, from physical, ordinary physical things, lidvarim, to ideas, ha'oim demiru mashalim v'chulu, which stand on the exalted levels of the heavens or the worlds. And what is the most prominent, the most popular mashal in all of Chassidus? Let's use this mashal as a mashal for our mashal for a mashal. The person. A human being is a metaphor for not God, but godliness. A human being is a metaphor for Atzilus, Adam Ha'elyon. Why? Because we're created in that image. We have a Chachma and a Bina, as the Alter Rebbe discusses just by way of example in letter 15 in Tanya. So if you study a person, you're supposed to understand godliness. Okay, study a person from now until, I don't know what, until spring. What does studying a human being have to do with studying Sfiras, Atzilus, godliness? It's a very, very remote mashal. But Chassidus spends hours and hours, pages and pages, discussions, analyzing what it means to be a human being. And of course, in Hasidic literature, the material about what defines a human being is also Chassidus. It's not taking it from biology or psychology. Chassidus tells you its own opinion of what it means to be human and says, by understanding the human being down here, you can reflect it backwards, you can extrapolate backwards to Adam Ha'elyon. So what do you understand when you study a Maamar Chassidus that talks to you about Chassidus' opinion of what a human being is? You understand the human being. What do you know about Atzilus? Well, you know it's supposed to be the same thing. As my teenagers say, more or less, approximately, basically, whatever. You know what I mean, I can't explain it. And I can go on with all the useless metaphors that are so frequent in the realm of young intellectuals, also known as adolescents. The metaphor actually is a barrier between you and the original idea. But it's a necessary barrier, because without the metaphor, you know nothing. With the metaphor, you have a basic idea, but the metaphor actually brings you closer to the idea and stands between you and the original idea. That's what the Parsha does. V'hinei hamashal hazeh, continues the Rebbe, line 109. This allegory, this metaphor, hu minyanam achedim, deals with totally foreign material, which has nothing to do with the idea that we wish to communicate at all. Rak, it is simply lefi, because using a metaphor, an example, it allows the theory, the idea, the underlying intellectual point, which is what the metaphor and what it is a metaphor for, share, is constant. And you therefore introduce the metaphor to allow the person to access the theory that underlies the idea, the initial idea. They should understand something of it in part. And the Rebbe says, V'zehu inyan parsa. That's the mystical concept of a screen between Atzilus and Bria. It re-represents what godliness is using a metaphor. And of course, as I explained to you before, what is that? It's the concept of godliness versus godliness itself. The Metzias of Elokus, about godliness, versus the Mahus of Elokus, godliness itself. Zehu inyan parsa, that's the notion of the screen, hamafsik, that separates between Atzilus and Bria. Shubachinas masech, it's a screen, which Mavdil separates because it's Lidaber Minyanam Acherim. We discuss something foreign altogether. Shalem Minyan Atzilus, which has nothing to do with godliness and Atzilus. Shesham, because in Atzilus. HaChochma, wisdom, ideas, which we called before V'lei b'Chochma Yediyah. He be'efen acher, u'mehus acher. It's a different type and of a different essence, a different quality altogether. She'eina me'erach, which is not comparable or measurable to oifen u'mehus Chochma, the type and the quality of wisdom, Shabbat Mabriya, in the realm of Bria. And consequently, Ve'ein beBria Yecheles. It is simply impossible for a creature living in the world of Bria, Lekabel Ha'oras HaChochma, to receive the muhus of the light of Ein Sof, which is Chochma Vatzilos, Kamei Batzilos, as it is in the world of Vatzilos. Rak, it is simply Shayadei Yapas HaMafsekes, this screen, or this metaphor, which obstructs Yihi Ha'oras Bechinas Chochma, you get a trace, the smallest idea of wisdom, which is proportionate, which is relative to Bibria, to the world of Bria, and you say, this is wisdom in Bria. Chochma has something in common with this, because, Atzilus has something in common with this, because Atzilus also has Chochma Gamkin as well. And Lefi Misko Tchenas, according to its blend and its character, that the idea should be accessible to the disciple, min hamashal, from the metaphor, and it develops in the mind of the disciple, of the student, the possibility to fathom that just as there's wisdom in Bria, which he can relate to, there is wisdom in Atzilus, to which he cannot relate. Let me give you this provocation, if you will. One of the things that I often say in my conversations with people is that there's God and there's the God concept. In many secular circles, they don't talk of God as a fact. They talk of God as an idea. And I tell people that the God concept is heresy. Because God is not a concept, God's a truth. And when you box in, when you contain God within the realm of a concept, besides for the fact that from a perspective of religion, you've dissociated, you've dispersonalized God, which is terrible, you've also defined him by reason and reason alone. And there's much, much more to God than the concept of a concept. And that's the difference between Bria and Atzilus. Atzilus experiences God. Bria knows the concept of God. Now in Bria, you know the concept of God so well that you worship him. You know the concept so well that you're bottled to him. You know the concept of God so well that you have a sense of God, but there's no intimacy. There's no personal sense of what godliness is. That's why it's called Metzias and not Mahus. Atzilus, as compromised as it is aware of godliness itself. Albeit it's a ha'ara, and a gila, and all the rest, but it's ein sof, chazav v'heya, kirov. Bria knows nothing of the sort, nothing of the type. So now, let's just make the following statement, and I made it before, I'm repeating it now. So, is Atzilus closer to the ein sof, or closer to Bria? And of course the answer is, it depends. In as much as the mahus of Atzilus is concerned, it's closer to the ein sof, because it shares its mahus with the ein sof. That it's Ein Sof. In as much as the midah, that means the measure and character and vessels of Atzilus are concerned, they have much more in common with Bria. But like Bria, there are midas and spheres, and Ein Sof doesn't have any of those. So Atzilus becomes the axis. It becomes the hinge across which the extremes of Ishtalshlus, Ein Sof and Nivra, interact and meet perhaps, and ultimately fuse and become one. They come together. V'lachay, and therefore, since in the world of Bria, the mahus of the Ein Sof isn't manifest at all, and all there is the Metzias of Ein Sof, the understanding, the concept of the Ein Sof, Nikra Bria Gamken Yesh Me'ayin, the world of Bria is considered created, Yesh, as an independent being, Me'ayin, from we don't know where. Me'ayin is like Me'ayin Yavar Yezri, from where? From a source which is completely non-existential relative to the existence of Elam Abriya. Yesh Me'ayin doesn't mean something from nothing. There's no such thing as nothing. It means from something which is relative to Bria, a non-thing. In other words, the muhus of Alakus, of Atzilus, is in no way like the Metzias of Alakus in Bria. It's not like Metzias of Alakus in Bria is a little piece of the muhus of Alakus and Atzilus. It's Ayin and Yesh. It's incomparable. It's in no way relative. It goes through this screen between Atzilus and Bria, which affects that the light that comes out the opposite side should be a reborn light, a completely new light of a completely different level and character. And again, I want to use language. Oir shel tulda is called ha'ara the ha'ara. The metaphor, the simplest illustration of Oir shel tulda would be the colors of a rainbow, which come from the sun's light but don't reflect it at all. So Atzilus would be Oir or Ha'ara, which is Me'ein Hamor, it reflects the Ein Sof. Bria would be Oir shel Tulda or Ha'ara the Ha'ara or Ha'ara Nevdelas, as it's sometimes called, coming from Atzilus but not reflecting Atzilus at all. It's not Mahus, it's only Metzias. Dainu, this means Shneur Ledvin is Chadish. Something has emerged which is completely new. The wisdom of the light in the world of Bria. Now this doesn't mean it's new that it didn't exist before. It means that it's new that although it's coming from Atzilus, it's not reflecting Atzilus and is not sensitive to Atzilus at all. Like by the way of analogy. Of the analogy that what the student develops in his own mind. Min hamashal, from the metaphor his teacher gives him, sha'amalei, which the teacher gave him, that since the metaphor that the student hears is alien to the concept which the teacher truly wants to teach the student, the student only knows what the teacher is thinking, not by hearing the teacher's initial concept, but the metaphor alone. This idea which the student reconfigures, redevelops, using the teacher's metaphor, who chodesh etzle, is entirely new. It emerged through the analog, through the analogy, and it's completely separate from this that is analogous to. The same is true in the Nimshal, the world of Bria. And it's reflecting what Atzilus gives it is in such a way that it is Eir Chodesh, entirely new. Shemes Chodesh, the Parsha, has been made new because it's gone through the screen. And the Alter Rebbe continues. The duality, the two-sidedness of Ein Sof and Atzilus, which I mentioned before and I'm repeating them now, is, on the one hand, Ein Sof is so far away from Atzilus, you have to have Siluk Lagamri and Bekia, that shows on distance. On the other hand, you have what's called Chazav V'Heyed and Kirev. Between Atzilus and Bria have the similar duality. On the one hand, it's Shin HaMahus, the light in Bria is completely different than the light of Atzilus. It's gone through the screen, it comes out the other way, and Ereshel Tulda, Ha'ar Nevdelas, Ha'ar Da'ar, and all the rest. On the other hand, the light of Atzilus itself goes into the screen and comes out the opposite side in a Shin HaMahus in a new way, but it's the same light, it hasn't gone away and come back. So the Parsha also has a duality similar to the duality of Tzimtzum and Kav on a lower level. And the Rebbe now is going to articulate this. And of course he's going to argue that on the one hand, the Parsha process affects a change which is closer, less radical, because the light of Atzilus actually goes into Bria. On the other hand, it's more remote because the screen changes it in such a way that it has a brand new Mahus and isn't simply Ha'ara of the earlier Mahus. Line 119, V'hine. Hamaskal Yavin, if you're intellectually intuitive, sensitive, you'll understand. When the original idea of the teacher gets lost in the metaphor that he passes on to his student, which is teaching a student, you must understand the following. The original concept of wisdom itself, as it existed in the world of the teacher in relationship with himself, is camouflaged, is vested in this metaphor. That's not simply potential, it's actual. When the teacher develops his metaphor and his analogy, he invests the idea in this new form. So it's not that he's separating from the original idea, but he's investing the original idea in this new foreign form. It is only since the metaphor, which is now carrying the original thought, is completely foreign to how this idea was understood initially. Ba'atzmei, as the teacher understood it in relationship with himself, it has emerged to teach. Shaloi in a completely different context. Lekach, therefore, says the Rebbe, line 129 at the bottom of the page, Haskolas haraf, the intellectual creativity and acumen of the teacher. Be'inyin, this idea, Shemeram is boy, which he's alluding to in the metaphor. Line 122 now, Ein haskalahi, that original thought, is not nidas v'niglas la talmud, visible and revealed to the disciple. El al pi hamashal, the student has only the metaphor. Shu in yanach, which is entirely different. Using the metaphor, the student now develops his own imagination about what the idea is. The student is getting something completely new. On the other hand, still, this new idea actually existed earlier. The very same theory, the very same principles, but in a higher level of concepts. And is entirely represented by the metaphor. A simple way of explaining this is, imagine you see a painting and describe it to an artist and have that artist redraw the painting. Your description is separate very much from the original visual, and you cannot transmit to the second artist the visual. In other words, you can't give him a sense of the impact of the totality of the painting, because you're using words and you're not using images. When that subsequent artist will reconstruct an original painting, even if the details are going to be loyal to the original, but the passion, the soul is going to be entirely new, because the soul is the part that you cannot communicate. Similarly, using a metaphor or an analogy is useful to replicate the original idea exactly, but its fire is gone, its mahus, its essence is gone. Line 125. This helps us understand when the mid of Chochma Vatzilis, for example, which we called Mahus Ha'orav Ein Sof, descends lias his havas bechinas Chochma V'chulu de Bria, to create Chochma in the world of Bria. So the Alter Rebbe, Shechochma Datzilus, the wisdom as it is in Atzilus, he b'Mahusa Vatzmusa b'Peil Mamish, as it was in Atzilus, as a Mahus Ha'or, as I described it before, is HaMislabesh, as the B'chinas Parsha goes into the screen, goes into the metaphor. The original idea is being put forth through this screen in a new form, but the same idea is being represented. V'geremezin is the cause of his Havos Chochma, the Bria V'chulu, of creating an entirely new category of wisdom as it exists in the world of Bria, as opposed to Tzimtzum Arishan, where although you have the Chazer V'Heir and the Kidav idea, on the other hand you have the Siluk Lagamri and the complete separation of the old from the new, and you have the Bakia concept. Harei Chochma de Bria, thus the wisdom of the world of Bria. Afalpisha, where Chadash is the one that is entirely new and separate from the original idea, because it's Mitzias Lagabi Mahuz, it's Er Chadash Eshal Tulda, Kamakim at the same time, Kfar Yeshla Eze Erech V'Yichas. There's some relativism and relatedness in Chachma Datzilus with the Chachma Datzilus, because this is a Midah and this is a Midah. Masha'en came Bechinas Tzimtzum made in Saf Lias Atzilus, as opposed to the Tzimtzum, which brings Ein Sof into Atzilus, which happens through Siluk, Lagamri, and Bekiya. Hainu Salmos, the light is removed and caused to disappear. Now it loses its identity as an independent being when that light is brought back, though it's Kiruv and Chazav Heir, it's brand new. In other words, as Yeshivisha people would discuss this and explain it, they would put it this way: what is closer, Lifnei Tzimtzum Arishan and Lachar Tzimtzum Arishan, or Lifnei Aparsa or Lachar Aparsa? Pre and post Tzimtzum Arishan or pre and post Parsa? And the answer is, it depends. In terms of Kiruv and Gilui, Ein Sof and Atzilus are much closer. But in terms of investment, in terms of hashpah, in terms of giving, Atzilus is much closer to Bria. That's the drama. Those are the two sides of the coin. And I trust and I hope, I hope and I trust, that at this point we have a sense of what Atzilus is, what Midas are. Their great distance from the Ein Sof, yet their closeness to the Ein Sof. Their great distance from Bria, yet their closeness to Bria. This is really the end of the first half of tonight's class. And we can say, I suppose, with some measure of confidence, we've explored Midas of Atzilus. And of course, we haven't explored them by themselves, we've juxtaposed them against what's above them and what's below them. Now we return to the context of this Maamar. This Maamar began with Pasach Eliyahu. As I discussed with you in our first class, Pasach Eliyahu was part of the Hagdama to the Tikkun Zer, the introduction to the section of Zer called Tikkunim, which essentially explains the Pasuk Bereshis. And you have that paragraph which all of us recite Friday afternoon in the Pasach Eliyahu. And for the record, Sfardim say that every day. Pasach Eliyahu is an exploration of the 10 Spheres as they emerge from the Ein Sof. So what follows from line 129 to line 143, which is today's quota, is now superimposing the concepts we've been exploring for the last few weeks over the language of the Pasach Eliyahu. And let's begin. Ein Sof higher than Atzilus is called one. But Ein Sof higher than Atzilus is called one and not the first. Meaning to say, it's not one after which comes two, it means one that is only, exclusive, there's nothing else. Or Yachad as opposed to Echad, or Echad as opposed to Rishon, as the Maimonides Chassidus illustrated and describe it. Ein Sof is absolute. Ein Sof is singular. There's no detail, there cannot be detail. There's no manifestation because there's no other. It exists in relationship with itself. Absolute unity, the deepest kind of unity. So the Zohar says, Antu Chad Alei B'Chushban. We praise God Almighty and tell Him you are one and you have no number. And we, of course, don't mean only God. We mean godliness. And you, Ein Sof higher than Atzilus Chad Alei B'Chushban. And of course, we go on to explain it more. Antu Chad Alei B'Chushban, Antu Eloi Kol Ilah, Stim Al Kol Stimin, Leis Machshavot Tfisa Beid Klal. Those are all the fancy words that in effect argue that Ein Sof higher than Atzilus is completely beyond any comparison to what we know in creation. But then it says, and I'm reading now line 130, and who da pikas asar tikun v'chulu, from the Ein Sof, though it's chad v'lei b'chushban, emerges as a spheres. Now how does that happen? If Ein Sof is absolutely one, chad v'lei b'chushban, there's no relationship with anything outside of itself, how do Ein Sof produce eser spheres? And the answer is because it's a gili of the mahus as a ha'ara. There are vessels that receive and divide or affect the full division of the one light into the 10 midas, into the 10 spheres, which makes the 10 midas both very close and very far from the Ein Sof in its chad v'lei b'chushban condition. Shemikol mokem, that it's true of Atzilas that Einu Bechinas Nifrad Lagamri, it's not entirely separate. Even though that all of us understand you cannot show relativism and closeness between Atzilus and him, namely, Ein Sof higher than Atzilus, Ein Sof higher than Atzilus is absolutely plain. And Chad v'lei b'chushban, and this is about 10 spheres, at the same time, the light of the Ein Sof in the Tzimtzum edition is included in the source. And then it's brought back, what we called Chazer v'Heyer and Kiruv, that though there is such incredible separation between pre and post Tzimtzum, the light after the Tzimtzum, in spite of the fact that it's been changed fundamentally, it's called Shaitis and Mazla. Nevertheless, at the same time, it's still Ein Sof because of Chazer v'Heyer and Kiruv. Thus, you can speak of the 10 spheres of Atzilus and say that they're one with the Ein Sof higher than Atzilus. In other words, the Mahus of the Ha'ara of Ein Sof is close to the Mahus of the Yetzim of Ein Sof. What the Mashal say for Yitzira people? Kishalheves hakshura begacheles. You have shalheves betecha gecheles, flame inside a coal, which would be a mashal for the Ein Sof. And shalheves hakshura begacheles, flame outside of a fiery coal, would be a metaphor for Atzilus. The light is shining, the light is visible on the outside of the coal, but it's intimately attached to the coal because this is Mahus of Elokus and this is Mahus of Elokus. Moreover, so you have Antu Dapika Satikunin, which is reflecting the Ein Sof and one with the Ein Sof. Moreover, Lanhoga Bein Holman, to govern the world. And the Alter Rebbe splits, and he says, Asar Tikunin is the Oyer, and Lanhoga Bein Holman is Bechinas HaKelim, the vessels. And he brings Kabbalah language, Tov, Alma, the Kesuf, and the 400 words of love, Uchulu. The Batzilus, Ivach, when we say that Atzilus, though it's a Mida and a Sphere and a Gili of Ein Sof and a Prat, is still Dovak and the Ein Sof higher than Atzilus, it's a Fil of Bechinas Kelim. Atzilus is called godliness. And the vessels of Atzilus are called godliness as well. And I believe that there's some discussion about the godliness of vessels in the Maimorim of Basi Lagan Tav Shechaf Aleph, where he brings the Shitas HaBaal Shem Tov and Shitas HaPardes about the godliness of Kelim. It's irrelevant for the moment. In this Maimon, at least, he's not saying that the vessels of Atzilus are godliness because they receive the light of Atzilus, but rather the vessels of Atzilus are godliness because God created godly vessels that are like hot coals, like sparks. They have no identity other than fire. For me to explain, says the Alter Rebbe, what we mean when we say that the vessels of Atzilus are not just conductors of godliness, but they themselves are godliness. Let me give you an example, and it's b'machshava, that when somebody holds in his imagination a physical thing, if you could imagine in your mind a park, so literally the park doesn't exist at all, or it exists where you've seen it last, but figuratively your mind is enveloping, is hugging, is holding that park in your mind. Shamachshavte, that your thought, makefes, hovers, encompasses. Afilu gashmi, even a physical thing, ke'evendem, like a lifeless stone. It's not an appropriate, it's not a precise mashal, because intellectually embracing a physical thing is not at all the same thing as actually possessing that physical thing. At the same time, k'tzas min k'tzas, to a small degree, Yachal hamaskil. It's conceivable for an intellectual who is intuitive. Le'ezboin, an haskil, to contemplate and to come to understand. Al derech hanimshal min hamashal hazeh. What this means on high as extracted from the metaphor of thought. And he explains. All of us appreciate about thought that it has the capacity in theory to embrace the physical thing within itself. Though the material one is encompassing in his mind is completely separate from the physical person, it's incomparable to the physical person. Nevertheless, there is the power of thought and imagination that has the ability, hamachaba, that can join, that liyizdava gashmi, even something material and physical, should be mukav b'machshava shomer, embraced in the mind, in somebody's head, which is spiritual. So just as we understand that thought can embrace worlds, and of course physically thought embraces nothing, but spiritually thought embraces everything, this is a way of helping us understand what we mean when we say that the vessels of Atzilus are also godliness. The same is true on high. There's a power and a possibility to join together the light, which is theoretical godliness, and kalim, the godliness is meant to govern the lower worlds, that the vessels too are godliness. Visham l'mayla, as the vessels exist on high. Hey mechubaram, they're one. Lias hakal achtos echad. They're completely one v'layeh part that they shouldn't separate, as the Kabbalistic statement goes. Iyu v'chayeh echad, iyu v'gamei echad. And it says in Tanya, this goes only on the spheres of Atzilus and not the Nevrayim of Atzilus. It's difficult for us to get our imaginations around this idea. But it's true that when you think about something physical, you are metaphysically, you are in theory holding that idea. Similarly, the idea that the vessels of Atzilus, which are the thoughts of worlds, are included in the light of Atzilus, affects that the vessels also are one with the Ein Sof. Ubechinas Kelim Atzilus, and the vessels of Atzilus, him Taf Almin, Elef Almin, the 400,000 worlds of love. And today, said Alpha Alman B'chol, the 13,000 worlds of something else, Shemechinas Nima V'Shad Zechol, which are called threads. And I don't know what these things are about. You're going to have to look them up if you wish. Like the division of thought, to a myriad of different types of divisions. So, the Kelim of Atzilus, which the Alter Rebbe calls here Lan Haga Bein Olmin, are about worlds. And because they're about worlds, they are distinctive and ungodly. Yet in Atzilus, they're one with the Ein Sof, like ideas, like physical things are included in somebody's imagination. So we've explained higher than Atzilus as Chad V'lei B'chushban. We've explained Atzilus as Apikas Asatikunin and also L'Hanhoga B'Ein Omen. And now the Alter Rebbe delves into the particulars. There are 10 spheres. And the 10 spheres in general go under 3 categories. Chad Arich, one is long. V'chad Ketzir, one is short. V'chad Benunin, one is average. And this is the way it says in Kabbalah, right? What's Lashon? Something, the Chesed Aruch. Something, the Gevura Aruch. I forget the term and I apologize. Chesed extends till Yesoid. Gevura doesn't extend that far. It extends less far. Yesoid Abba Aruch, I think it is. Yesoid Ema Kotzer. I could be wrong. But something to that effect. The point is, Chesed is long. What does that mean, says the Rebbe? Chesed nikra arich. Why is it called long? Now, again, Kabbalistically it means that the light of Chesed extends very low. And I've explained this to you on previous occasions, that what's special about Midas HaChesed is that every emotion has love within it. You can't even hate without love. You can't hate strangers. Because the idea of Chesed is to give from the highest levels to the lowest levels, as waters descend from a high level to a low level, and the argument can be made, you see the true power of what has descended at the end. So being long means God giving generously. Ugevuras is called katsir, short, because what does Gevura mean? The meed of Gevura is not bringing godliness into the world, but raising of the world up into godliness. Thus the godliness is not extending downward, but embracing the world that ascends upwards, and therefore Nikra Katzir is short. Shu makatzer umagbel. It concentrates and limits hashpoas chesed, the flow of kindness, that it shouldn't be unconditional, sheyiheh, that we should receive only lefi ha'halot mimata lamala, what we invest from the bottom to the top. So chesed means giving unconditionally, gvura means giving inconditionally, and that's why it's called a short line. And the Rebbe doesn't explain Tiferes. V'chad beinuni, one is average, because Tiferes combines both of the ideas, and we're going to have to leave this for a different Maamar, because our Maamar doesn't explore it. So if I had to summarize tonight's class, we learned two things. A, we explained Parsa, the closeness and distance, if you will, between Atzilus and Bria. And last week, of course, we talked about the closeness and distance between Atzilus and Ein Sof. And then we tied it into the words of the Zohar. And notice I'm leaving myself 5 lines for next week, which is, of course, very self-serving. I might as well finish the Maamar. And I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that because I intend on giving you a full class where we will explore, first of all, the Pasuk, which is the basis for the Zohar, which is the basis for this discourse. And then we have a couple of very wonderful surprises.